And we are back. What is up, everybody? We are entering quite possibly the best little mini series on my channel. This next probably 5 to 10 videos are epic. And I'm not just saying it. I've been trying to create this for a very long time and never really got to it. It's really difficult to make some of these advanced videos, and I'm so excited to share this with you guys. So if you're using SwiftUI, you are well aware that property wrappers are the cornerstone of SwiftUI. Anytime you create any SwiftUI view, you're using @state, @binding, @state object, @environment, @environment object, @app storage, and the list goes on. All of those @something are property wrappers, and they're all specific to working in SwiftUI. We literally cannot build a SwiftUI application without property wrappers. So we're using these all the time, but a lot of times while we're using them, we don't fully understand what's going on under the hood. So in this series, in the next bunch of videos, we're gonna build up to actually creating our own custom property wrappers. Now, I could have just done one quick video and said, here's how to write a custom property wrapper. But as you guys probably know, if you've ever even looked into it, just writing a blanket property wrapper and writing a struct doesn't really click in my head, at least, what is actually happening in this property wrapper. Why do we need these? How do they work? And then how can I make my own? So that's what we're gonna really dive into. And we can't just dive into that without first doing a couple prerequisite videos. And the first video we're gonna look at is a custom binding. So when you're using property wrappers, a lot of times in SwiftUI, we use like that money sign or that $sign, which references actually something called a projected value inside a property wrapper. So when we're trying to bind to something, we use that money sign. Well, that's sort of confusing. A lot of people don't really understand what is that money sign? Where is it coming from? Why is it a binding? So in this video, we're first gonna do a deep dive into bindings. What are bindings? How do they work? How do we create our own custom bindings? And then we're gonna build up to actually understanding that projected value and why that money sign or that $sign syntax comes into play. So in this video, we're first gonna break down a binding. We're gonna realize that a binding is nothing more than a getter and a setter. And then we're gonna create some custom bindings to start to really polish our code. Again, we're gonna build up in the next bunch of videos. This is one section where I highly recommend watching them in order because this knowledge aggregates really well, and we're gonna build up to some of the best probably SwiftUI code that you've ever written. And I only say that because it's some of the best that I've ever written. So with that said, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I hope you are as excited as I am. If you're not excited, go grab a coffee because this is gonna be hard, but it's also gonna be worth it. Let's open up Xcode and write some code. What is up, everybody? Welcome back. Again, I am in the Advanced Learning Bootcamp, and we are going to learn about custom bindings. And I just want to say before we begin the next couple videos here, find a seatbelt and strap on it because this is going to get crazy. Seriously though, we're going to talk about custom bindings here. I think bindings is something that has confused a lot of people in SwiftUI. I will explain exactly what bindings are in this video. And then when we get into the property wrapper video and a couple videos in the future, I think it's all going to start to connect. Because a lot of the stuff that is quote unquote under the hood in SwiftUI is really just custom bindings. So that's why we're going to really dive into a lot of this stuff right now. All right, I'm super excited. I'm stoked because once I learned this, SwiftUI got so simple for me, and I think it will for you guys as well. All right, let's right click the navigator, create a new file. It's going to be a SwiftUI view, of course, and we'll call this one the custom binding bootcamp. Let's go ahead and click create. Let's jump inside here. Let's get our preview working. And I'm going to make the text a little bit bigger so that you guys can see it a little bit better. Sorry, I forget to do that in a couple of the videos for those of you who are watching on iPads and things like that. Anyway, we're going to start off with a simple binding. So I will create up here an @state var. Let's call it title of type string. And let's just set it equal to the word start for now. Very simple string. Let's put it on the screen. I'm going to put a VStack on the screen, and let's put a text that shows the title. And let's start with a basic binding. So what is a binding? Let's go back to the actual binding property wrapper in SwiftUI. So I'm going to create down here another struct, and let's just call this child view. Let's call it child view. Let's make it a view and open the brackets. Every view needs a body. And inside this child view, we're just going to put a text with the title on the screen. Now we're going to bind to the title from the first view into the child view. So we'll create an @binding var title of type string. Then we'll put that title onto the screen. All right, very cool. Let's put a child view on the screen. So up here, I'm going to put the child view and I'm going to look for the title. And the title is now going to look for a binding that is of type string. And as you guys probably already know, we can't just pass in title because that's the value of it. We need to pass in the money sign, the $sign title to access the binding within the property wrapper of the state property wrapper has a projected value that is a binding, and we access that value with the money sign here. In an upcoming video, we're going to talk about property wrappers, and I'm going to explain in detail exactly where this is coming from. But for right now, we just need to know this is how we bind in SwiftUI. You probably already knew that. And just to exemplify again why we are binding, because when we pass a value from parent to child, normally the child is not allowed to update that value. But if we are binding, the child can then update the value back to the parent. So from inside my child view, I could do like an onAppear, and I can set the title equal to a new title. So I'm binding in that we're passing the state of the title to the child view, and then the child view is able to actually update it and pass that update back to the parent view. And that's why both have the new title on the screen here. And so now we're going to just break down what a binding really is. And so there's really two things that are happening here in this child view. Firstly, the value, the current value from this state, so the starting value, so I'm just going to comment this out. The value is being passed down to the child view. And then at another point in time, which we did onAppear, a new value from the child view is getting passed back and getting set in this @state up here. So there's two parts. There's the getting the current value, so passing the value from here down to the child, and then also setting the new value. So passing a new value back up to this property wrapper and setting the new value. So two parts to a binding, getting and setting. All right. We're going to do another example now, except we're going to pretend that we didn't have access to this binding. So this binding, this @binding property wrapper is a convenience thing that the SwiftUI team has given us in the framework. But really, a binding, as we just saw, is a getter and a setter. So if we didn't have @binding, how would we do this? Well, we would create probably another struct. Let's call this child view2 of type. Every view needs a body. And then as I just mentioned, there's two parts to this. There's getting the value and then setting the value, right? So first, let's just get the value. If we just wanted to pass the value as is from the parent view down to a child view, we could just pass in a let. We'll say let, let's call this title of type string. And I will put on the screen here a text with the title. All right. On the child view 2, let's put it on the screen and pass in the title. Awesome. So we can see that it worked. It passed down to the child view 2, which is the third one on our screen here. And now when this appears, we want to trigger a function that is going to actually set a new value for this. So if we didn't have the binding, so the reason the binding is awesome is because we can just very easily set title equal to a new value. But if we didn't have that, we would want to instead trigger a function that we could then call and update this value. So in here, I'll say let's call it set title. And we're going to pass in a function that returns void or nothing. And then this function will accept a string, which will be our new title, as a parameter. So on Appear, I'm going to call this function that we've passed into this view. So this function is called setTitle, and it accepts a string. So I'm just going to put this as new title 2. All right. So when this view appears, we're going to call this function. Now this function is not immediately going to update the title. It's just going to trigger the closure of the function. So when I call child view 2 now, I can pass in the title, and then I can get this closure back here. So this set title. If I click enter here, this will be our new title. And now I have access to the new title in our parent view. So I can set the title equal to the new title. So when I run this now, I think this should appear and then call new title 2, and we can see it on the screen here. So here's how I would do it if we didn't have a binding. We pass in the get, we can get the current value, and then we have a function to set the value back. So without a binding, this is basically how we would do it manually. All right, again, this and this are doing basically the same thing, except this is using the binding property wrapper, and this is just manually doing it. You could call it maybe the old school way. All right, before we move forward now, we're going to do another example. So I'm going to create here a struct called child view 3. It'll be a view, and let's open the brackets. Every view needs a body. And again, we're going to put on the screen text with a title. Now, I don't have the title here yet. Now, I want to show you guys that up here, we're using a property wrapper, which is a SwiftUI specific property wrapper. But binding, so this binding property wrapper is specific to SwiftUI, but a binding in general is not specific to SwiftUI. So for example, when I went to pass in this binding for this property wrapper, I'll do it again right here. It asks for a binding, which takes a generic type, and this binding was of type string. So that's what this type is right here, a binding of type string. So we're setting up a property wrapper, but this binding of type string is not specific to a property wrapper. It is just a binding. And so we can actually just create these bindings without using these property wrappers. So for example, in my new child view 3 here, property wrapper, I'm just going to pass a binding from one view to another. So let's call this title and make it a binding of type string. All right. And when we are accessing the title inside of a binding, it's not just the string that we want to put on the screen. We can't just put the title on the screen. We want to access the value that is inside the binding. So the value inside that binding will access the .wrapped value. And then we'll do the same thing, .onAppear. We'll set the type new title 3. Let's comment out new title 2 for a second. And let's put child view 3 onto the screen. So coming up here, let's again bind to our title. And let's put also child view 3 on the screen. And just like this money sign title, we can bind to the money sign title. So here we use the property wrapper, which is a convenience method from SwiftUI. It's just a binding. Here we've passed in the binding directly. So we've passed in a binding of type string. Now I wanted to show you guys this because the reason we have this $ title is because inside the @state property wrapper is a binding. So I'm going to cover property wrappers, I think, in 2 or 3 videos ahead of this one. And we're going to get really intricate, and you're going to understand this $ much more because we're using it a lot in SwiftUI. But if we didn't have an @state here, we could actually create a binding ourselves. We can create it essentially on the fly whenever we want. So for example, I'm going to create another child view 3 here. And instead of using the binding from the title, I'm going to create my own binding. All right. Obviously, we can use the title. There's nothing wrong with doing this. I'm just doing this for example purposes so that we can understand binding. So again, a binding is a getter and a setter. So how do I create my own binding? I literally will type binding, and a binding, as we can see here, has a get and a set. That's what it takes to create a binding. So click enter here. So now we need a function that returns a value. So when we want to get the current value of this binding that's inside this binding, how do we want to get it? What function do we want to call to get that value? And obviously, we just want to get the current value of this @state. So I'll click enter here, and the current value is going to be, let's return the title. So when we get the value for this binding, we'll get the title. And then when we set a new value, so coming the other way from the child view 3, coming back up to the parent view, we're going to click enter here. We're going to get the new value. And what do we want to do with it? Well, we want to set the title equal to this new value. So here in code, I've created my own custom binding. So a binding has a getter and a setter. It's just that normally all of this is done for us. When we use this $ title, it's creating a binding to the string inside that state property wrapper. So here we're just creating our own custom binding, and we're saying when we get the current value, this is how we will get it. And when we set the value, so meaning when we update the value from down here in child view 3 and we update the wrapped value, we are setting a new value for this binding. So when we set a new value here, we're actually triggering this closure. So we're triggering the setter of the binding, which is passing back a new value. And then we're going to set title equal to the new value. This is really cool. We're going to start using custom bindings much more in the next couple of videos. I just wanted to really just dive into what they were before we just start using them on the fly. But before we wrap up this video, I want to give you guys just one quick example of when something like this could come in handy. So on the screen here, let's put a quick button that maybe says, click me, because of course every button in our app says click me. And we're going to do something when we click this button. So up here, let's create maybe an @state private var. Let's call this error title of type string. Let's set it equal to, let's make it optional, set it equal to nil to start. And we'll do an @state private var, maybe show error of type bool equals false. If you guys are doing errors in SwiftUI, this is something like this is probably a pretty common setup for you. We have a Boolean that we're going to bind to show our alert, and we're going to have the content for that error. So coming down onto this VStack, let's add an alert. And it looks like this is presented as deprecated. We're going to come down here and use maybe this title is presented in actions. So this is just a basic alert. You've probably done this 100 times if you're building SwiftUI apps, right? So what should be the title of our alert? Let's just add the error title. And if there is none, let's just say error. And then we need to bind, when do we want to show the alert? So is presented is a binding with a generic type of Boolean. So again, this @state is of type Boolean, and inside every property wrapper is a projected value. The projected value is accessed via that money sign, and the @state has a binding as a projected value. So here I can bind to the Boolean with a $ show error. And then actions, I'm just going to click enter in here, and let's just put maybe a simple button on the screen that just says like, okay, click enter. When we click this button, we're going to set the error title equal to new error. And then we're going to say show error dot toggle. So when I click it, new error appears on the screen and it's working perfectly. But what am I getting at right now? So this is a super simple example, but to me as a programmer, at least, it's not a good practice, or it's kind of annoying to have this binding separate from this error title. So for example, right now I set the title and then I call show error. But really, every time I set this title, I want the error to automatically appear, right? What happens if I have a really complex app and maybe one time I set the error, but I forget to call show error dot toggle, right? So now I can click me and the error never appears. And so right now with the current setup, I need to make sure, I need to keep both of these in sync at all times. And I think we run into that a lot with SwiftUI because we have these bindings in a lot of the modifiers. So for example, the alert has an is presented, the .sheet has an is presented, the full screen cover has an is presented, and these are all bindings of type Boolean. So what's really cool is when we start dealing with custom bindings, we can actually just customize the getter and the setter inside all of these bindings. So instead of having to deal with managing extra state like this, we can just bind to whether or not there's a value inside this string, for example. So we're going to do that real quick. So I'm going to actually comment out this show error. And what we're going to do now is we're going to basically try to say, anytime the error title is not nil, we automatically want to show an error. Because when we set the error title, we also want that to indicate automatically that show error should be true. So rather than managing these separately, we're going to only set error title, and then our app should automatically know if this gets set, then we should show that as the error. So how are we going to do that? All right, so I'm going to actually copy this alert, and I'm going to comment it out, and I'm going to paste in a copy of it here. So we're going to keep everything the same except for this binding. So let's remember, this is a binding of type Boolean, right? So before we were dealing with a binding of type string. So down here, we did a binding of type string. So when we had our getter, we needed to get a string, and the new value we were getting was a string as well. The new value was a new string. And when we get a value, we get a string. When we get a new value, the new value is a string. Here, we're going to do a Boolean. So here, when we create a function to get the current value of the binding, we need to get a Boolean value for the current value. So up here, I'm going to create a binding, and every binding again has a getter and a setter. So I'll click enter on the get. Now we're going to ask ourselves, all right, when we want to get the value of is presented. So where are we going to get the current value from? So in here, we want to get the value. We're going to say return if the error title is not equal to nil. So if the error is not nil, then this binding value should be true. Otherwise, it should be false. All right. So if the error is not nil, we should show the alert. Otherwise, don't show the alert. So if the error is nil, don't show the alert. And then we have our setter. So I'll click enter here, and this will be our new value. So the new value is also going to be a Boolean. So in our previous examples, we were setting that wrapped value to a new title here. But in this alert modifier, this is a binding, and the is presented is actually inside the SwiftUI framework. Now this setter, let's remember, is the new value here coming back is a Boolean, because this is a binding of a Boolean. And so it's a little confusing because this is actually happening behind the scenes here. So before, and I'll actually show you guys again, if we put this one back on the screen, right? Every time I toggle this, show error occurs. And if I click OK, it dismisses, and I can continue to show it every time. And the reason it keeps working is because SwiftUI automatically, when we dismiss this alert, is setting the wrapped value inside this binding back to false. So we set this to true, and then we dismiss the alert, and it gets set automatically back to false. So just to show you guys that, I can put on the screen here text with the show error.description. So it's false. It's going to be true right now, and then back to false. SwiftUI is automatically setting the value of this binding back to false. So in our custom binding here, SwiftUI is setting the new value. So here we're going to say if the new value is false, so if not true, so not new value, then let's set the error title back equal to nil. All right. So we're going to click show the new error and then dismiss. And just like that, we now have gotten rid of the need to actually manage a separate state to show this error. And this is really handy because basically, as I showed you guys before, all of those SwiftUI modifiers like sheet is presented, or full screen cover, or alert, or confirmation dialog, all these things that have these bindings. Without making custom bindings, you would have to manage these states separately. But with custom bindings, we can bind to other pieces of data to streamline our data flow and make sure everything is much more in sync in our SwiftUI apps. This is definitely a little confusing when you first start using it, but once you get the hang of using some of these bindings, they make your code gorgeous. Honestly, they make your code look really, really clean and smooth, and it's easy to create these once you get the hang of it. before we wrap up this video, let's just optimize this a little bit. Firstly, error title is not equal to nil. If that is true, we're returning true, otherwise false. Any good Swift developer knows that we can just return this as the statement itself. And we also don't need the return word here. Awesome. And then lastly, personally, I don't like how this looks. This code looks pretty confusing to me. I much prefer to create actually extensions so that we can initialize bindings directly rather than having to write this custom logic every time. So I want to walk you guys through one quick example of how we could write this maybe a little bit better in your projects. So let's do it up here above our project here. I'm going to create, and again, before I get into this, this is an advanced course. So you should know already what generics are because I covered them earlier in this course. I'm going to move fast here, and this is hard code. So we're going to create an extension of binding, so the type binding, but we want to do it where the value inside the binding is equal to a Boolean. So right here, remember the isPresented is a binding of type Boolean. So we're specifically looking at the Booleans here. And what I want to do is create an initializer so that I could initialize this binding here from an optional string directly. So rather than writing this code every single time in my app, I could just bind basically to the optional string and all of this will be handled automatically. So I write this code once and now I can bind to any optional string on any screen. So what we're going to pass in, we want to pass in the actual error title binding. So for example, if let's just say, let this equals, let's do the $error title. We can see that this is a binding of type optional string. And that's what I want to pass into this initializer. So I'm going to come up here and pass in let's call this a value of type binding of type optional string. All right. And now what are we going to do? Well, we're going to initialize a binding the same way we initialized this binding here. So I'm going to actually copy this code and I'm going to paste it here, except instead of creating when we're in the initializer of a binding, so we actually just want to call self.init, and then we're going to have this code here. So the init, the error title is not equal to nil. Now we're going to look inside this binding here. So we're going to say value.wrapped value. So the string value inside the binding is not equal to nil. And then for the setter, the same thing we did down here with the new value. We're just going to say if not new value, we're going to set the value. So this value binding here, .wrapped value back equal to nil. And I will comment this out here. Now I'm going to come back down to my app because we have this awesome binding and we should probably use it. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to comment it out. I will paste another version here. Let's cut this and I'm going to open up a binding. And now we have a new initializer with a value of binding of type string. And I will bind to the error title. Look how clean this code is, guys. This is such clean code, right? We don't have to write that every time in our app now. We can just click on it and it works that easily. This is so cool. And we're going to wrap up by just making this a tiny bit better because really right here, we're checking if the value of this is not nil and then we're setting it to nil. But really that has nothing to do with the fact that this binding is of type string, right? If this was a Boolean and it was an optional Boolean, this would be the exact same code. Or if it was an integer, this would be the exact same code, right? It's just an optional that we're dealing with. So really, instead of just binding this to a string, we should just make this generic. So we could pass in type T and we'll make this of type T as well. So now I could bind to any optional value, whether it's an integer, a Boolean, a string, whatever you want. Awesome. All right, that's it for this video. We learned what custom bindings are. In the next couple videos, in the next video, we're going to actually build on this error here, and we're going to look at some more advanced ways to handle errors in SwiftUI apps. And this is a great starting state. I think this code is so much cleaner than how we started, but we can really build on this and get this even better. In the videos after that, though, we're going to start building on these custom bindings and eventually start building our own property wrappers. So you're going to understand why this $, where it's coming from, why it's coming into play, and how we can customize and build our own. So strap in. I hope you guys are ready. Comment below if this video helped. I can promise you that once you start building more advanced SwiftUI apps, these bindings are like a godsend, because every modifier in SwiftUI has some sort of binding, and it can get really annoying to have to manage that state separately. So once you get the hang of creating custom bindings, you really can start to polish some of that code in your app. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I better see you guys in the next couple videos, because this was a setup for the next 5 videos. See you in the next one.